What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are continuing on with Fear itself. And here was the deal with Fear itself. I kind of want to talk about this for a second because there's a couple things that I feel like we need to explain looking at the comments of the previous videos with some of the questions you guys had. First and foremost, Fear itself was one of these stories that was designed to rework things. Marvel still had a lot of things that had been held over from the Joe Quesada era or at least his whole idea of pushing things and making a new direction. So essentially everything from like Avengers Disassembled running all the way up to really the heroic age, running all the way up to Dark Reign. So over the span of about 7 years or so, there were a lot of things that had happened, a lot of status quo changes. The Avengers were disbanded, they were replaced by the new Avengers. 98% of the mutant population lost their powers. There were a lot of things that went on in Marvel at the time. One of the most notable things was the death of Captain America, and we'll talk more about that here in a second. But what this story was designed to do in a lot of ways was to take a lot of those threads that had kind of been left hanging, those plot threads that had just sort of been dangling all this time, and essentially wrap them up, to basically tie up loose ends. Now, not all of them were tied up, and in fact, the ones that weren't tied up were designed or were left that way for the purpose of telling future stories later on down the line. For example, the formation of Stark Resilient, which would come later on, different things like that. But the idea here is that we initially pick up with Captain America facing off against, the forces of sin, and really what kind of passes for Hydra, but not really. But again, this is not like Steve Rogers' Captain America. This is Bucky Barnes' Captain America. Now, the reason why I feel like that needs to be explained is because one, I don't think I explained that in the first or second video, and two, this event, Fear itself, actually wraps that up. So when Captain America died after the events of Civil War, and following that, Iron Man, I'm pretty sure it's Iron Man, takes Captain America's uniform and gives it to Bucky Barnes. And so Bucky Barnes becomes the new Captain America. And his arrival was met with it was a mixed reaction. Some of the old guard who really wanted Steve Rogers to stay, and there were some who were the old guard that wanted Steve Rogers to go. And then of course there were new fans who wanted to see Steve Rogers stay, and there were old fans new fans who wanted to see him go. It was really kind of a mixed bag of people who wanted to see different things. But in any event, Steve Rogers had come back about a year before this story took place. He came back 2009, 2010, somewhere along those lines. And it was, of course, the Captain America Reborn storyline where you found out he was time displaced. They basically pulled a Batman from Final Crisis. But then once he made his return, there was a one-shot follow-up. And it was basically the question of who's going to wear the shield? Who's going to have Captain America's shield? Is it going to be Bucky or is it going to be Steve Rogers? And what this did is it allowed Marvel to spin Steve Rogers out into a whole other series called Secret Avengers. And Secret Avengers basically served the purpose of having like a Black Ops team for the Avengers group. But that's the team that Steve Rogers largely led, and that was his whole thing. What this does is it basically removes Bucky Barnes from the mantle and it brings Steve Rogers back. But at the moment right now, with this initial charge going into the US Capitol, it really is Bucky Barnes leading the team. Now, switching over to Asgard, this was an interesting situation because this again deals with Kid Loki. And that's one of the things that goes on here. When it comes to the event of Fear itself, it was a little bit different from a lot of the other crossover events that you saw, in the sense that Journey into Mystery was designed to provide the back end for why it was Loki was doing what he was doing in the main story itself. Whereas in a lot of the events that go on, sometimes, especially like when it came to like Secret Empire, for example, the tie-ins are wholly separated from the main story itself. And so you'll have like the beginning of the event, of like Secret Empire, for example, and then it'll split off into tie-ins. And the tie-ins will show what characters are doing, and then they'll wrap back into the main event at the end. And so unless you've been reading the tie-ins, you have no idea how that character got to where they were. With this, it's totally different. Fear itself was designed to be kind of like a new age of storytelling when it comes to crossover events. It was basically this idea of like the main story gives you all you need, and you don't really need anything else. But you go read Civil War, and it's woefully incomplete if you don't read the main, or if you don't read the tie-ins. Nothing really seems to make sense. And so it's one of those interesting scenarios. But nonetheless, Kid Loki showing up here is basically for the purposes of breaking Thor out of prison. What Kid Loki's been doing so far has basically been trying to sow revolution within the Asgardian landscape. The problem with this is that under most normal circumstances, people may have been inclined to side with him if it wasn't him, if it wasn't Loki. If it was Thor, people would follow him. It would basically be Thor leading a revolt against Odin, which isn't really something Thor would do, but with Kid Loki, he definitely would. The problem with this is that, again, Kid Loki's got the reputation of Loki. And so everybody would look at what he's saying and essentially coming along and being like, look, Odin's kind of lost his mind. We've got to find a way to stand up to him. We have to go back to Earth and we have to protect it. They would look at it as some kind of ruse. And so nobody really trusted Loki. And so at this moment, it's just kind of coming along and saying, okay, look, we've got to free Thor. Like, we got to get Thor out of here and get Thor back to Earth. And so in the interim, what this does is it picks up with really this kind of calamity across the board, in the sense that Absorbing Man basically has the powers of Thor. The Incredible Hulk now has the powers of Thor. I mean, it's all these crazy situations. And in response to the Incredible Hulk, what this ends up doing is bringing in like Carol Danvers, Spider-Woman, Jessica Drew, which I don't even know why she's there. Here's a funny thing. So Jessica Drew has the ability to emit pheromones that will not really have the exact same effect as Purple Man. She can't really dominate the wills of others, but she can make them fall in love with her. Now, she tried it on Wolverine. In fact, myself and Sal at Comic Pop were having this cool conversation. I called him up, but we ended up getting, like, he ended up talking about Jessica Drew, about Spider-Woman. And he's like, well, Spider-Woman tried her pheromones on Wolverine, and all it did was make him dizzy. So people with healing factors can combat it, but they're not like totally immune to it. With the Incredible Hulk, it would have to be the same way. But keep in mind, this Thor Hulk, for lack of a better word, is basically like mindless savage Hulk, but bent for a particular purpose. But all these people who are wielding these hammers are all driven by fear. That's the important thing to bear in mind here. And the reason why is that when we switch over to the Fantastic Four, with the hammer having landed on Yancey Street in New York, the Fantastic Four were one of the first people to respond and to investigate. Now remember, while all this is going on, the world is going to pot. Like, everybody else is dealing with a zillion different things. But when the Fantastic Four chime into the Avengers and say, hey, look, we're investigating things, then that means you leave the Fantastic Four to their devices. And so with Ben Grimm showing up, the hammer starts talking to him. He starts hearing voices emanating from it. And when he goes to pick it up, of course, he's transformed into a mindless beast itself and just starts ripping everything to pieces. So again, every single person that gets one of these hammers is driven by fear and serves the purpose of sowing chaos. That's basically what this is. And the reason why is because the serpent feeds on fear. So long as those around him are feeling fear, he'll continue to grow stronger and you know, basically gain more and more power. Now for Thor himself, where he's freed by Loki and basically meets with Sif and the Warriors 3, the idea of basically standing against Odin, of leaving Odin's eye, traveling to Midgard, it amounts to heresy. This is a very dangerous game they're playing, because while Odin wouldn't necessarily kill them, Odin would certainly, like, he could banish them from Asgard, he could make them mortal, like send them away. The Odin force is capable of doing all manner of different things. Again, it's a very dangerous game that they're playing here, and this game is discovered when Odin shows up. Now, this is kind of a funny thing here. This is really sort of feeding on the old nature of the Thor comics, the historical, publication history of Thor comics, as opposed to what we would expect. With Odin having previously locked up Thor and Loki breaking him out, and then coming into the situation where Thor's basically been freed and he's talking of revolt against Odin, it's not really like Thor's talking of revolt in the sense of leading the armies of Asgard against Odin himself. It's basically Odin walking in to his son and his friends, talking about abandoning Odin's view and traveling back to Midgard. And at this point, it's one of those things where it's like a father and a son. Sons always get a lot more leeway with fathers. It's just the way it is, because it's their offspring. Parents are a lot more lenient with kids. And so instead of like casting Thor to prison, instead of making him mortal or something like that, he says, fine, then you'll have your quest. If what you want to do is go to Earth and fight among the people who are there, then do that. Now, a lot of this stems from the fact that Odin knows how stubborn Thor is. If Thor says, this is what I want to do, I want to go to Earth and I want to fight alongside the Earthlings because I feel more kin to them than I do to you, then Odin's going to be like, fine, because there's no talking Thor out of it. And so ultimately, Odin casts him out, sends him back to Earth, gives him his hammer and says, here, you'll need this, but you've got a time frame. Once the serpent's power rises, like once he gets to the point where he's all powerful, where he seizes control of Earth, then one of two things is going to happen. Either I'm going to bring you back or I'm going to let you die. But regardless of what fate it is, you've brought it on yourself. And so again, it's kind of a cool thing, because switching back to Captain America in the Capitol, with him, Falcon, Black Widow, facing off against Sin with all this new power, it's interesting because one of the things to bear in mind is that when it comes to Marvel, when it comes to stories like this, oftentimes they kind of seem to stretch the limits of credulity and they don't really seem to make sense. And the reason why is because you're dealing with someone with a formidable amount of power, both in strength, speed, durability, as well as the power she wields by virtue of her hammer, and would easily be able to crush Black Widow, Falcon, and Captain America. And so the question you would probably ask is, why are these the ones fighting? Well, in reality, the Avengers never really consisted of the most powerful beings in Marvel Comics. That was really reserved more for the X-Men. The Avengers were mostly just like the bravest people. They'll run headlong into their own deaths, but they'll run headlong. No, aside from the Incredible Hulk, Thor, the Avengers usually consist of mid-range to some of the weakest characters in the Marvel Universe. I mean, it's Captain America. What the hell can Captain America do? He can punch really hard and run fast and throw a shield. He's not ultra strong. He can't, control the elements. I mean, he can't do any of that cool stuff. The X-Men can, which some people will say the X-Men are kind of broken, which they are. Sidetrack, think about that for a second. All right, so among the mutant population, you've got Franklin Richards kind of, depending on who's writing the story. Sometimes he's a result of the cosmic control rod, which is basically Galactus's power, the power cosmic from the negative zone, or he's a mutant. You've got Storm, who's pretty much Omega level. Why the hell haven't they confirmed it? You've got Magneto, you've got Emma Frost, you've got Matthew Malloy. I mean, you have like all these super powerful Omega level characters who are just broken as hell. Like, dude, the X-Men are so broken. Somebody make an argument in the comment section. Somebody create an argument and tell me why the X-Men are not OP and broken. If you can make a convincing argument, I will give you a Rob Core ring. So moving on from our little rant, our little diatribe, of course, Sin takes it to Captain America. And that's the important thing to remember. Captain America is kind of like the leader of the group, right? Like, he's like the moral support. If you take him down, then most everybody else will lose their moral backbone. She ends up ripping off the arm of Bucky Barnes, plunges a staff right through his chest, and it essentially seems to kill him. And that's really the end of him. Like, that's the end of Bucky Barnes. You know, at this point, he's just kind of like, look, you have to tell everyone the Serpent is literally the person behind this, because at the moment, they haven't known. The Avengers haven't really known who's behind this. All they've known is that these artifacts, which they learned were hammers, had crash landed on Earth. Different people had picked them up. They gained insane levels of power, and they'd just been attacking cities. By having contact with the hammer itself, he's learned the hammer's secrets. And the hammer's secrets are that it's basically the Serpent who's behind all this, who's waging a war against Earth, and eventually seeks to set his sights on Asgard and retake the throne. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explain, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Core. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.